How do you shoot down a fighter that does not want to survive? Captain Robert has 90 seconds to answer this question. He does not know it yet. 27,500 feet above the Japanese capital, January 27th, 1945. The cockpit of his B-29 smells of aviation gasoline and cold metal. His oxygen mask is rimed with ice at the seal against his cheek. His gloved hands are steady on the yoke of a 60-ton bomber loaded with 6 tons of high explosive. In front of him, through the plexiglass, the outer suburbs of Tokyo slide beneath the nose. Behind him, 10 men. Beside him, 61 other B-29s in formation. Above him, coming down out of the sun, 43 Japanese fighters. Captain Robert has trained for this. He has flown 12 missions. He knows what a Ki-44 looks like when it makes a firing pass. He knows what a Ki-44 looks like when it breaks off. He does not know what a Ki-44 looks like when the pilot has decided not to break off. He is about to learn. In 4 minutes, one of those fighters will hit his aircraft. In 15 minutes, a second one will. In 8 hours, Captain Robert will be back on Saipan filing a report that no one will fully believe. And the number he writes in that report will not be the truth. He will not know that either. Not until the war was long over. Not until a generation of American historians and a generation of Japanese archivists sat down together in the 1980s and compared their paperwork for the first time. What follows is what those archives finally revealed. The names of the American crew in this account are composites. They stand in for the men of the 73rd Bombardment Wing who actually flew mission number 22. Every event described is drawn from squadron records, mission reports, and Japanese unit histories that survived the war. The men were real. The mission was real. The numbers, when we finally count them honestly, are what this story is about. Before we return to the cockpit at 12:22 in the afternoon, you need to understand how 62 American bombers ended up over Tokyo on this specific day, at this specific altitude, facing this specific weapon. His name was Emmett O'Donnell. His friends called him Rosie. He was 39 years old, a West Point graduate from the class of 1928, and he commanded the 73rd Bombardment Wing on the island of Saipan. Rosie O'Donnell had a problem. His problem was mathematics. Since November of 1944, the 73rd Wing had flown 21 missions against Japan. On each mission, the bombers climbed high, pushed into a river of wind moving at 200 knots, fought Japanese fighters climbing to meet them, dropped bombs from the Norden bomb site, and watched most of those bombs miss. 21 missions. 31 B-29s lost. 340 men gone. And the industrial targets in Japan were, for the most part, still standing. The problem was not courage. The problem was not skill. The problem was the jet stream. Nobody in 1944 fully understood the river of air moving at 200 miles per hour above 30,000 feet. Bombardiers trained on the Norden site in Nevada, in Texas, in Kansas, where the wind at bombing altitude was 50 knots on a bad day. Over Tokyo, the wind was 4 times that. Bombs released from 29,000 feet did not fall where the bombardier aimed them. They were carried 3, 4, 5-mile wind by a force that Americans had only just discovered. 7 days before mission number 22, on January 20th, 1945, a change of command took place at 21st Bomber Command Headquarters on Guam. Brigadier General Haywood Hansel, who had led the strategic bombing campaign against Japan since November, was relieved. In his place, General Hap Arnold sent Major General Curtis LeMay. LeMay would change the strategy of the B-29 campaign completely. He would take the bombers down to 5,000 feet. He would fill them with incendiaries. He would burn Tokyo on the night of March 9th, 1945. But that was 7 weeks away. On January 27th, 1940, O'Donnell was still flying the old plan. High altitude, daylight, precision bombing. One more attempt at a target that had defeated the 73rd Wing 6 times before. Target number 357, Musashino, also known as the Nakajima Aircraft Engine Plant, located on the northwestern edge of Tokyo, in a suburb of factories and rice fields. Musashino built the engines that powered the Ki-44 Shoki, the Ki-43 Hayabusa, the Ki-84 Hayate. Every fighter that climbed to meet the B-29s was, in a sense, born inside this factory. The 73rd Wing had bombed Musashino 6 times. The factory was still producing engines. The mission would be mission number 22. 76 B-29s from Isley Field, 6 tons of high explosive per aircraft. Bomb release altitude 27,500 feet. Weather over target, clear. Expected fighter opposition, heavy. One of those 76 aircraft was a backup bomber. It was not the aircraft any crew had planned to fly. The primary superfortress assigned to Captain Roberts' crew had been pulled from the line at 0400 hours with a fuel transfer pump failure. 4 crews swapped aircraft that morning. Captain Roberts' crew was one of them. The bomber they climbed into had 40 hours of airframe time. The fuel gauges were unfamiliar. The trim wheels felt different. The number 3 engine had a faint vibration on run-up that the flight engineer noted but could not identify. They took off at 0615 anyway, because in the 73rd Bombardment Wing, in January of 1945, you flew the aircraft you were given. You flew the mission you were assigned. You did not delay mission number 22 for a vibration you could not name. While Captain Roberts' crew climbed over Saipan, 90 minutes ahead of them and 1,500 miles to the north, another briefing was ending. The location was Narimasu Airfield, on the northern edge of Tokyo. The officer speaking was Major Yohei Iwahashi, commander of the 47th Sentai. His audience was 36 fighter pilots, most of them under the age of 25, all of them flying the Nakajima Ki-44 Shoki. The Ki-44 was not a beautiful aircraft. It was short and thick and blunt-nosed, with a radial engine so large it looked like the fighter had been designed around it. The Japanese called it Shoki, Devil Queller. American intelligence called it Tojo. It could climb to 16,000 feet in just over 4 minutes. Its top speed, at 17,000 feet, was 376 miles per hour. It carried 4 12.7mm machine guns, 2 in the nose and 2 in the wings. The Nakajima Ha-109 radial engine that powered it produced 1,450 horsepower and, unlike some later Japanese engines, was relatively reliable at high power settings. But the Ki-44s of the 47th Sentai's Special Ramming Detachment were different. Several had been stripped of gun ammunition beyond a bare minimum load, of external stores, of every ounce of removable equipment. These aircraft were lighter, they climbed faster, they accelerated harder. They were not intended to shoot down B-29s, they were intended to hit them. The tactic was called Tayatari, body attack. It was not kamikaze doctrine. The Imperial Japanese Army would not formally organize suicide units for months yet. This was something else. This was volunteers, in ones and twos and threes, deciding that the mathematics of the war had changed. One fighter for one bomber. One Japanese life for 11 American lives, 6 tons of bombs, and one aircraft worth $600,000. The exchange rate was acceptable. Everyone in the room understood the arithmetic. Major Iwahashi called the names of the volunteers. The pilots stood. Each one had already written a letter to his family. Each one had already drunk a small cup of sake in the wooden hangar behind the briefing room. Each one had bowed, in silence, to a photograph of the emperor pinned to the plywood wall. The youngest was 20 years old. The oldest was 24. Their names appeared in the 47th Sentai duty roster for that day. Their letters home would survive the war in the archives of families in Fukuoka, in Kagoshima, in the mountains west of Kyoto. At 0700 hours, they walked out to their aircraft. At the same moment, 1,500 miles to the south, Captain Roberts' B-29 crossed 20,000 feet in a slow climb over the Pacific. He did not know the names of the men who would try to kill him today. He did not know their ages. He did not know that several of them had already decided that they would not land their aircraft again. He only knew that the sky ahead of him, somewhere beyond the horizon, was full of Japanese fighters. And he knew, because every man in the 73rd Bombardment Wing knew by now, that the Japanese fighters over Tokyo were not fighting the same war anymore. Something had changed. At 12:22 in the afternoon, above the Musashino suburb, Captain Robert was going to find out exactly what. The formation crossed the Bonin Islands at 9:47 in the morning. Iwo Jima passed under the wing. A grey triangle of volcanic rock that most of the men in the bomber stream would not think about again for another 3 weeks. In 3 weeks, the Marines would land on that island, and a generation of young Americans would learn a word they had never heard before: Suribachi. But on January 27th, 1945, Iwo Jima was just a waypoint, a navigation checkpoint on the long road to Tokyo. The flight engineer called out fuel state over the interphone. Numbers on a page. Captain Robert acknowledged. The B-29 climbed through 24,000 feet, then 25, then 26. The air outside the aluminum skin was 50 degrees below zero. Inside the pressurized cabin, it was warm enough to work without gloves. The unpressurized sections were different. In the tail, in the blister positions, in the gunner stations, the temperature was whatever the outside air decided it would be. The gunners wore heated flight suits with electrical elements sewn into the fabric. When those suits worked, they saved lives. When they failed, they killed men slowly through the 6-hour trip home. At 11:45, the coast of Honshu appeared through the plexiglass. The Boso Peninsula, a hooked finger of land east of Tokyo Bay. Japanese radar operators at Chiba had been tracking the American formation for over an hour. Air raid sirens had already begun their long mechanical wail over the neighborhoods of Seta, Gaya, over the factories of Musashino, over the wooden houses of Nakano and Suginami, where women were pulling children indoors and old men were carrying buckets of water up to rooftops. At Narimasu, the pilots of the 47th Sentai were already climbing. The Ki-44s came up in pairs, then in fours, then in a final formation that included the Tayatari volunteers. They climbed at the maximum rate their engines allowed. Cylinder head temperatures did not matter. Long-term engine wear did not matter. The only thing that mattered was reaching the American altitude before the bombers passed the initial point of the bomb run. At Shofu, Major Teruhiko Kobayashi was already in the air. 24 years old, commander of the 244th Sentai, the youngest fighter group commander in the entire Imperial Japanese Army Air Force. Kobayashi was flying a Ki-61 Hien, a liquid-cooled inline engine fighter that the Americans had briefly mistaken for a German Messerschmitt. He was leading 18 aircraft. He would engage the American formation before the day was over. 12 o'clock, straight up. Frank was 20 years old. He came from a neighborhood in Pittsburgh where his father worked in a steel mill. He had been in the Army Air Forces for 19 months. He was the central fire control gunner on Captain Roberts' aircraft, which meant he sat in an astrodome behind the pilots and controlled 4 remote turrets through a targeting computer that was, in January of 1945, the most sophisticated fire control system on any aircraft in the world. Frank saw the first Ki-44 at 12 o'clock high, 12,000 yards out, climbing almost vertically through scattered cirrus. He called it out over the interphone. Captain Robert acknowledged. The flight leader in the lead bomber acknowledged. Then Frank saw the second fighter, and the third, and the fourth. By 12:07, 43 Japanese fighters were within visual range of the American formation. The battle began the way most battles between B-29s and Japanese interceptors began. High-side passes, fighters diving from 11 o'clock or 1 o'clock, converting altitude into speed, firing brief bursts at maximum deflection, breaking away hard before the concentrated fire of the American gunners could catch them. Frank fired his first burst at 12:08. The upper forward turret hammered. 50 caliber tracers arced toward a diving Ki-44. The fighter jinked left and disappeared under the formation. No hit. Frank did not have time to be disappointed. 2 more fighters were already in his sight picture. At 12:15, the formation reached the initial point of the bomb run. The initial point is a specific place on a map. It is the location where a bomber stops maneuvering and begins to fly in a perfectly straight line, at a perfectly constant altitude, and a perfectly constant speed. This is the moment when the bombardier takes control of the aircraft through the Norden bombsight, and the pilot becomes a passenger, and the bomber becomes a target. 6 minutes. That was the length of the bomb run from the initial point to bomb release. In those 6 minutes, the aircraft could not turn, could not climb, could not descend, could not accelerate, could not decelerate. The Japanese pilots knew this. They had learned it over Nagoya in December. They had confirmed it over Tokyo on January 9th. They had refined their tactics over Ota on January 14th. They knew exactly when the American bombers would become defenseless, and they knew exactly how long that defenselessness would last. At 12:17, the 47th Sentai attacked from 10 o'clock high and 2 o'clock high simultaneously. Frank tracked the 10 o'clock attacker. His targeting computer calculated a firing solution. He pressed the button. 50 caliber rounds streamed toward the diving Ki-44. Tracers from 2 other B-29s in the formation converged on the same fighter. The Ki-44 flew directly through the crossfire. Its canopy shattered. Its engine erupted in black smoke. The fighter snap-rolled right and fell away. Frank claimed the kill. So did the gunner in the aircraft to his left. So did the gunner in the aircraft to his right. 3 men watching the same fighter fall, each of them absolutely certain that his rounds had done the killing. Remember this moment. It matters more than you know. At 12:21, the second wave came. 2 P-44s, then 2 more, then 2 more. They rolled in from 2 o'clock high in staggered pairs, firing as they came. Frank engaged the lead fighter. He fired. He hit. The P-44 rolled left and dove away, trailing smoke. Probable kill. Frank did not have time to confirm it, because the second fighter in the pair was not firing. Frank saw the muzzle flashes on the first P-44. He did not see them on the second. The second fighter was not shooting. The second fighter was not maneuvering. The second fighter was flying in a perfectly straight line, at a perfectly constant angle, directly toward Captain Roberts' aircraft. Range 400 yards, Frank shouted into the interphone. The co-pilot, seated to Captain Roberts' right, reached instinctively for the yoke. Captain Robert pushed his control column forward. The B-29 nosed down 2 degrees. 2 degrees at 400 yards, with a closure rate of 600 miles per hour, is not enough. The P-44 hit the number 3 engine at 12:22. The impact sounded, to Frank in the Astrodome, like a locomotive hitting a wall. The fighter's propeller shattered against the B-29's cowling. Aluminum tore. The P-44's wing sheared off at the root. The wing spun backward over the fuselage of the bomber, missed the number 4 propeller by less than 3 feet, and disappeared into the sky behind the aircraft. The fighter's fuselage broke apart. The engine section, still carrying the pilot, tumbled downward past Captain Roberts' cockpit. For one fraction of a second, Captain Robert saw the Tayatari pilot through the canopy of the P-44. 22 years old, eyes closed, not screaming, not fighting the controls, at peace. The fighter's fuselage passed under the bomber's belly and fell toward the earth, 27,000 feet below. The B-29 yawed violently to the right. Warning lights blazed across the flight engineer's panel. Number 3, engine on fire. Number 4, losing oil pressure. The propeller on number 3, torn free of its shaft, tumbled away into empty air. The flight engineer hit the fire suppression bottle for number 3. Captain Robert feathered number 4 as a precautionary measure. The aircraft settled into a shallow right yaw, 2 engines, descending at 300 feet per minute. The bomb bay doors were already open. In the bombardier's compartment, First Lieutenant James had held the Norden bomb sight on target for the last 4 minutes. At 12:21 and 20 seconds, the bomb sight reached solution and released the rack. 6 tons of high explosive fell away from the wounded B-29, still on the calculated trajectory of the sight. Those bombs hit the Nakajima Musashino aircraft engine plant. The plant had been bombed 6 times before. It had never been significantly damaged. On January 27, 1945, at approximately 12:24 in the afternoon, the bombs from Captain Roberts' aircraft and from other aircraft in the same formation struck the main assembly building. Post-mission reconnaissance photography from the 3rd Photo Reconnaissance Squadron would later confirm the hits. The mission was, in a technical sense, a success. Captain Robert did not know this. Captain Robert was flying a B-29 with 2 engines, a damaged wing, and a 1,500-mile trip home to Saipan. 3 P-44s peeled away from the main formation and dove toward the crippled bomber. Fighter pilots follow damaged bombers the way wolves follow a wounded elk. It is not cruelty, it is arithmetic. A damaged bomber cannot maneuver. A damaged bomber cannot maintain altitude. A damaged bomber is a lower-risk target than a bomber in tight formation with functioning defensive coverage. Michael, the tail gunner, was 21 years old and had 2 confirmed kills before this mission. He tracked the lead attacker. He fired. He hit. The P-51 broke off, trailing smoke, and disappeared into the cloud layer beneath the formation. The right blister gunner engaged the second attacker. Cannon fire from the Japanese fighter walked across the B-29's fuselage. Plexiglass shattered. Shrapnel sprayed into the compartment. The blister gunner took fragments in the shoulder and the neck. His 50 caliber guns fell silent. Frank slaved the lower aft turret to his controls. He tracked the third P-51. He fired. He hit. The fighter rolled inverted and fell away. At 12:31, the last of the immediate attackers broke off. The B-29 was alone at 19,000 feet over hostile territory with 2 engines, a wounded gunner, and a jammed rudder trim that made every input to the controls feel like moving through wet concrete. At 13:07, over the coastline south of Chiba, one more P-44 came in. This one was not attacking as part of a formation. This one was not coordinating with a wingman. This pilot was alone. His fuel was low. His ammunition was expended. He had come south from the main engagement following the trail of smoke. Frank saw him at 6,000 yards. The P-44 was closing from 7 o'clock low, climbing, accelerating, not firing. Frank understood immediately what was happening. He called the Tayatari. Captain Robert acknowledged. Michael in the tail acknowledged. The right blister gunner, bleeding into his flight suit, tried to reach his controls and could not. The P-44 closed to 4,000 yards. Then 3. Then 2. Frank fired the upper aft turret. His rounds converged on the fighter. Hits sparkled across the cowling. The P-44 did not deviate. The engine trailed smoke. The pilot did not turn. Range 1,500 yards. Range 1,000. Range 500. At 300 yards, Michael in the tail fired a 5-second burst. His 50 caliber rounds tore across the fighter's left wing. The wing separated at the root. The P-44 tumbled. The remaining mass of the fighter, still traveling at over 300 miles per hour, struck the vertical stabilizer of the B-29 at 13:08 in the afternoon. The impact tore 40% of the rudder assembly free. The aircraft yawed hard left. Captain Robert applied full right rudder. The controls responded halfway, then jammed. The rudder pedals would move no further. He compensated with differential thrust on the 2 remaining engines, feeding more power to the left side, less to the right. The yaw stabilized. The aircraft flew in a controlled crab at 15,000 feet over the open Pacific. The interphone was quiet for a long moment. Then Michael's voice came through from the tail position, 21 years old and steady. Right stabilizer took the hit, sir. He came apart before he got to us. Captain Robert acknowledged. The B-29 turned south. The engines held. The wounded blister gunner, wrapped in Frank's spare flight suit liner, breathed shallow but steady breaths in the frigid rear compartment. The bomb bay was empty. The target was destroyed. And ahead of them, between the aircraft and the runway at Isley Field, lay 7 hours of open ocean, a fuel gauge that did not add up, and the quiet certainty that at some point in the long flight home, one more Japanese fighter might still find them. The navigator's name was William. He was 23 years old. He came from a small farming town in Nebraska, where his father raised corn and his mother taught school. In the 15 minutes after the second Tayatari, William did what navigators do. He opened his charts, he picked up his pencil, he calculated. The numbers he wrote down did not work. Distance to Saipan, 1,512 miles. Airspeed at current altitude with 2 engines and asymmetric drag, 160 miles per hour. Estimated time en route, 9 hours and 30 minutes. Fuel remaining, based on the flight engineer's transfer calculations, 7 hours and 40 minutes. William wrote the numbers twice, checked them a third time, and passed the clipboard forward. Captain Robert read the numbers. He did not change expression. He passed the clipboard back. 200 miles east of the Boso Peninsula, Captain Robert had a decision to make. The submarine service maintained a lifeguard patrol along the return route from Tokyo to the Marianas. American submarines surfaced at prearranged coordinates to recover B-29 crews that could not make it home. The radio operator, Sergeant Peter, had already made contact. A submarine was on station 140 miles to the southeast. She would remain surfaced for 3 hours. Captain Robert considered the arithmetic. Ditching a B-29 in open ocean, under ideal conditions, killed a significant fraction of the crew that attempted it. Ditching a B-29 with a jammed rudder, a damaged wing, and a wounded man who could not swim killed more than that. But ditching next to a friendly submarine at a known position in daylight gave the survivors a real chance. Continuing to Saipan, on the other hand, was not a chance. It was a bet. A bet that number 2 engine would hold for 7 more hours at maximum continuous power. A bet that the auxiliary fuel in the Bombay tanks would transfer correctly. A bet that the jammed rudder would not fail completely. A bet that no more Japanese fighters would find them over the empty Pacific. Captain Robert ran the numbers. The gap between ditching and continuing was smaller than most men would have thought. But there was one more factor. A B-29 ditched in the ocean was a B-29 lost. A B-29 landed at Isley Field, even in a wreck, could sometimes be cannibalized for parts, engines, propellers, turrets, radios. In January of 1945, the 73rd Bombardment Wing needed those parts more than it needed almost anything else. Captain Robert keyed the interphone. "We're going home." The crew acknowledged. Sergeant Peter transmitted a courteous refusal to the submarine. She confirmed and remained on station in case another aircraft needed her. The B-29 flew south. The next 7 hours were not dramatic. They were mathematical. The flight engineer, a master sergeant named Charles, transferred fuel between tanks in careful sequence. William plotted position fixes every 30 minutes using dead reckoning, corrected by the occasional star sight through the astrodome. Captain Robert and his co-pilot traded control of the aircraft in 1-hour rotations to prevent fatigue. Frank, in the astrodome, watched the sky for aircraft that never came. At 1400 hours, Charles recalculated the fuel state. The numbers were better than William's original estimate. The Bombay tanks had been fuller than expected. The single functioning engine on the right wing, running lean at reduced power, was burning less fuel per hour than the flight manual predicted. The gap between fuel remaining and distance remaining had closed to 90 minutes. 90 minutes was still too much, but at 15, 100 hours. The jet stream at their altitude shifted. Instead of a headwind of 40 knots, they picked up a tailwind of 20. The airspeed over the ground climbed to 190 miles per hour. The estimated time to Saipan dropped by an hour. By 1700 hours, the numbers worked. Barely. Captain Robert did not celebrate. He kept flying. The wounded blister gunner was named Anthony. He was 22 years old. He had grown up in New Jersey, in a neighborhood where his father owned a shoe repair shop. He had joined the Army Air Forces in 1943 after his older brother was killed in North Africa. The shrapnel that hit his shoulder and neck 1231 had not severed any major arteries, but he had lost enough blood that he was cold and going into mild shock. The morphine syringe in the first aid kit had frozen solid in the unpressurized rear compartment. Frank warmed it under his own flight suit for 10 minutes before it thawed enough to inject. Frank stayed with him for most of the trip home. He wrapped Anthony in his own flight suit liner. He talked to him about home, about baseball, about what Anthony would do when the war was over. Anthony listened and answered when he could and stayed conscious. Anthony would survive the mission. He would spend 6 weeks in the hospital at Isley Field. He would fly again in April of 1945. He would return home in November of 1945 and take over his father's shoe repair shop. At 2100 hours, the navigation lights of Isley Field appeared on the horizon. At 21:45, Captain Robert began his approach. The landing gear did not fully deploy. The hydraulic system, damaged by both Tyatari impacts and slowly bleeding fluid for the last 8 hours, had not enough pressure to lock the right main gear into the down position. Charles worked the emergency hand crank until his arms failed. The gear went halfway down and stopped. Captain Robert had 2 choices: belly the aircraft in with no gear at all, or land with the nose gear and left main deployed and the right main partially extended. He chose the second option. He had 2 engines. He needed every foot of runway. A wheels-up landing on grass beside the runway would probably destroy the aircraft. A landing on the runway itself, even a bad one, gave them a chance. At 2200 hours, the B-29 crossed the runway threshold at Isley Field. The main gear touched down first. The left main held. The right main collapsed on contact. The aircraft yawed hard right, then hard left as Captain Robert compensated. The left wing dropped. The wingtips struck the concrete and dragged. Sparks erupted along 100 feet of runway. The nose came down. The aircraft slid sideways. It came to rest half on the runway, half in the grass, 1,700 feet from the threshold. The propellers on the 2 functioning engines were still turning. Captain Robert shut them down. The B-29 sat quiet in the darkness. Ground crews ran toward the aircraft with fire trucks and ambulances. The rear escape hatch opened. Frank helped Anthony out first, then Michael, then the flight engineer, then Sergeant Peter, then William, then the co-pilot, then Captain Robert. 10 men on the ground. 1 dead man still on the aircraft. First Lieutenant James, the bombardier, had taken a 12.7 millimeter round through his compartment shortly after the first Tyatari. He had lived long enough to see the bomb rack release on target. He had died before the second impact. Captain Robert signed the aircraft over to the maintenance chief at 22:30. He walked to the debriefing tent at 22:45. He drank a cup of coffee. He answered questions. He filed his report. The report said his crew had shot down 7 Japanese fighters. That number was wrong. It would take 4 decades for anyone to prove how wrong. In the 1980s, a generation of American aviation historians began cross-referencing 21st Bomber Command mission reports with the surviving unit histories of the Imperial Japanese Army Air Force. 2 Japanese historians, Ikuhiko Hata and Yasuho Izawa, published the first comprehensive study of Japanese Army fighter units. American researchers combined those records with the mission summaries at the Air Force Historical Research Agency at Maxwell Field. What they found when they finally counted honestly was this. The 47th Sentai and the 244th Sentai together lost a handful of aircraft during the entire Mission Number 22 engagement, a fraction of what the American gunners had claimed. Across all 76 American bombers on that raid, the American crews collectively claimed close to 200 fighters destroyed. The actual Japanese losses were a small fraction of that number. Captain Roberts' crew's real kill count on January 27, 1945 was probably 1, possibly 2, almost certainly not 7. This does not mean the crew lied. This does not mean Frank invented his kills or Michael exaggerated in the tale. What it means is that a burning Ki-44 falling through 6,000 feet of sky can be seen by 12 different gunners on 8 different aircraft, and each of them can be certain that his rounds killed the fighter. And each of them can be right about what he saw and wrong about what actually happened. The Japanese did the same thing. Major Iwahashi's after-action report to headquarters claimed his Sentai had shot down more than a dozen B-29s on January 27th. The actual number of B-29s lost across the entire mission to all causes was 9. And of those 9, only about half were confirmed lost to fighter attack. The others were lost to flak, to mechanical failure, and to the long cold trip home over an ocean that did not care who won the war. Overclaim is not a lie. Overclaim is what happens when human beings try to count things that are moving too fast, in too many directions, in a sky that is too big. Rosie O'Donnell continued to command the 73rd Bombardment Wing through the rest of the strategic bombing campaign. He went on to a distinguished career. He retired as a 4-star general in 1963. He died in 1971. General Curtis LeMay, who had taken over 21st Bomber Command a week before Mission Number 22, would change everything about how America bombed Japan. On the night of March 9th, 1945, he sent 300 B-29s over Tokyo at 5,000 feet with incendiary bombs. That single raid killed approximately 100,000 civilians in a firestorm that consumed 16 square miles of the city. More people died in Tokyo that night than died on the first day of either atomic bombing. Major Yohei Iwahashi did not live to see the end of the war. He was killed in action in May of 1945, defending Tokyo against a B-29 raid. Major Teruhiko Kobayashi survived the war. He returned to civilian life in a defeated Japan. He died in 1957. He was 37 years old. The Tayatari pilots of the 47th Sentai, who took off from Narimasu on the morning of January 27, 1945, met different fates. Several of them successfully rammed American bombers and were killed in the impacts. Several were shot down by American defensive fire before they could complete their attacks. A few survived because their engines failed or their aircraft damaged were mauled before they reached their targets, forcing them to break off and one, whose first attempt aborted with engine trouble, flew a second sortie later the same day and rammed a B-29 belonging to another bomb group in the afternoon. He did not survive. Their names are inscribed at Yasukuni Shrine in Tokyo. The B-29 that Captain Robert flew home never flew again. Maintenance crews recovered the engines, the propellers, the gun turrets, the radios, the Norden bomb sight, and every other component that could be salvaged. The airframe was cut up for scrap. Captain Robert flew 19 more combat missions. He completed his tour in June of 1945. He returned to the United States. He got married in November of 1945. He worked in Ohio for the rest of his career. He raised 3 children. He rarely spoke about January 27th, 1945. Frank flew more missions before the war ended. He returned to Pittsburgh. He worked in the same steel mill where his father had worked. Michael, the tail gunner, did not survive the war. He was killed later in 1945. During one of the mining missions, the 313th Bombardment Wing flew against the Shimonoseki Strait when his aircraft was shot down. His body was never recovered. Anthony, the wounded blister gunner, ran his father's shoe repair shop for many years after the war. He was buried, when his time came, in a family plot in New Jersey next to the brother he had joined the Army Air Forces to avenge. The story you have just heard is not the story of an American bomber that shot down 14 Japanese fighters. That number does not exist in any credible record of the Second World War. The story you have just heard is what actually happened on January 27th, 1945. A bomb run completed under fire. 2 Tayatari attacks survived. 1 man dead. 1 man wounded. 1,500 miles of ocean crossed on 2 engines, and a debriefing report filed at 22:45 that overstated the kill count by a factor of 5 or more. The truth is smaller than the legend, and the truth is stranger. Because the truth is that a 20-year-old gunner from Pittsburgh and a 22-year-old volunteer pilot from Fukuoka met each other for 1/5 of a second at 400 miles per hour, 27,500 feet above a Japanese suburb on a Saturday afternoon in January. And neither of them ever really understood what happened next. That is the story of the air war over Japan, not the numbers, the men, and the sky that took most of them.